Hey there, this is Danielle with Sacred Site Wellness, talking about psychologically supportive spirituality, and today's topic is conflict. Conflict is a really challenging topic to navigate psychologically, like in a practical manner when you're dealing with challenges in relationships or challenging dynamics. But when you start to bring some sense of spirituality into it, it gets like a little bit easier, and maybe not even just a little bit easier, but a lot easier. So I wanted to talk about this. I think it's really helpful as well, and stuff that we all have to manage in our day-to-day life to some level, whether you have tension with family, your spouse, your child, at work, right? We all are trying to navigate attuning to each other and confronting different perspectives on things between us. Usually this comes out if you're trying to meet a certain goal or purpose with another person. That's when you really start to see conflict. If there's no purpose or meaning in your interaction, there's no real care for conflict, or it wouldn't matter, right? So what the other person believes is irrelevant. So I feel that's important to recognize, because if you're in a conflict with someone, try to observe what is the purpose of the relationship, or what is the intention or goal trying to be met that the conflict is rising into. It's really important to help navigate conflicts just from the beginning. Now, the next layer that I think is a little bit more of where we face our difficulty with conflicts is how to manage, number one, the discomfort that we feel inside, and like throw that against the challenges of the interaction we're facing from another person. So what I mean by this is that there's two layers. Experientially, we have what another person might be saying or doing to us, and sometimes that is really conflict focused and really difficult, maybe even harmful. But then there's also this other layer of how we feel inside, and because conflict is naturally challenging and causes discomfort within us, now we have two barriers, or not even barriers, but two layers we have to navigate through, right? So an example of this happening in a really practical application is if you're in a conflict with someone and someone starts yelling at you and calling you names. Yes, that's harmful and problematic externally, and then internally we're also going to feel a variety of emotions and challenges and discomforts. And so we're going to react out of this combination of these layers, right? We're going to feel uncomfortable inside and emotionally triggered. So we're going to act out of that. Then we also are dealing with someone who is not approaching us in a helpful manner or productive manner. And so we're going to respond to that as well. And so usually what will happen is maybe you're going to try and set a boundary with someone, but because you're also emotionally flared, you may yell it at them. So like, again, practical application, you may say like, you can't talk to me that way, and there's a lot of energy behind that and a lot of strength, because you're trying to set a boundary as far as what's appropriate in communicating with you, and then you're also managing like how you feel. This is just one small example, but I wanted to highlight it because these two components may become more influential depending on who we are and our personality and the relationship dynamic that we're in. So another example is that sometimes people get very emotionally triggered off of things where externally it is a more manageable conflict for someone else. So an example with this is that if someone's discomfort inside is so great, it may cloud them from recognizing that this other person just doesn't recognize their boundary, and therefore we can communicate it in a proactive way that doesn't necessarily cause emotional triggering. But because we're so emotionally triggered inside, it comes out really harsh, almost overly aggressive or firm. And so maybe we say, we start yelling or we start calling that other person names because we feel our boundary is crossed when they perhaps weren't doing something that would warrant that level of a response. We may have these levels of responses because of, past experiences or childhood, and perhaps we're feeling emotions of, unworthiness or shame, or perhaps your childhood is used to that high intensity conflict, right? So that becomes normal, and we don't even have the self-reflection to recognize when we're like triggered into that type of communication style. Another thing that comes up is avoidance. So when you're in a conflict, it's very practical to have to communicate how you're feeling and what you're experiencing in a certain situation. Sometimes people will tell themselves a narrative, which I do a video about, is stories and narratives we tell ourselves. Someone will have a narrative that says, this person is intentionally disrespecting me and crossing my boundary. So I'm not even going to talk to them. I'm not even going to communicate with them how I'm feeling or communicate this boundary that I have. And they operate in a way that expects the other person to know, which is also not very fair in a relationship, nor is it contributing to managing conflict in a healthy way. What I want to highlight right here is someone who knows how to manage conflict will never experience conflict. I want to say that again. Someone who knows how to manage conflict will never experience conflict. And I know I got two negatives in there, so it's a little bit confusing. But ultimately, someone who knows how to manage conflict is still going to have to deal with conflict. There's still going to be people out there that maybe don't agree with them, that don't like what they have to say, and you're still going to potentially see some management of that discord happening. But how you know someone is effectively managing conflict is that there is a engagement and commitment to attempting some type of repair. Oops, I don't know if that paused. I have a low battery. But there's going to be some attentiveness and commitment to repairing the conflict. So an example of this is if you have two people with different perspectives, you still have to communicate, right, that you have a different perspective. But can we do it in a way that's respectful, maybe focusing on pieces of connectivity, or focusing on the common goal, right, which is something that we discussed in the beginning of the chat. Can you refine like what's the main purpose and reharmonize from that? Or maybe there's some sort of collaboration that's needed. Maybe you'll never see eye to eye. Maybe you do have to agree to disagree, but there's a collaboration happening. So it's you know what, I don't agree with you, but I respect how you got to your perspective, and how can we both feel fulfilled and heard and considered, even though we have different perspectives on this. That would be like a collaboration. So again, conflict is a necessary part of life. It's how do we manage conflict? What is the skill that's required within that? So a lot of what I'm talking about up to this point is like the psychology behind conflict and really relationships, because every relationship has conflict. If you don't have conflict in your relationship, you're avoidant. That's what that means. That should be a red flag. And when I say conflict, I don't mean like yelling at each other, but you're gonna have differences in perspective. And because you're trying to meet a common goal, you have to work out those differences in perspective. You may even just call it a disagreement, right? Conflict is a really broad term. I don't say it meaning like a harsh disagreement where there's arguing or headbutting. It doesn't have to be to that level of like an argument. right? But conflict is still where there's just something that's not matching or resonating, right? Or harmonizing from two sides as you're accomplishing a goal or some sort of purpose. So that's the psychological part. Just in a nutshell, like entire books are written on this kind of stuff. So please recognize that there's a ton of other things I could talk about on this topic. But what I really want to get down to is how does spirituality integrate into this discussion of managing conflict? Spirituality, from a psychology journal definition, is bringing an awareness to an immaterial force or being that brings a sense of connectedness and wholeness. So if, I'm going to call it God, because that's what aligns with my beliefs. Some people may call this force or being creator. And then there's a variety of spiritual ideologies that demonstrate our relationship to that being or entity. Yet, as I've researched a variety of spiritual ideologies, Eastern and Western, the one that gives the most thorough kind of food for thought about this is the Bible. Again, look at it from a stance of curiosity. I know that there's a lot of triggers that come with the term the Bible and Jesus Christ and Christians. But if we kind of just get curious, like, okay, what does the Bible say about relationship with God? And that's essentially the entire book of the Bible. It is a library of books that is showing this wild dynamic of being a human and having a relationship with God. And what does that look like in a spiritual realm? What is God's character? What is this relationship between good and evil, suffering and joy, this life and potentially more than this life? It's food for thought right now. If you're feeling resistances to that idea, consider it food for thought. But anyways, if you kind of like reflect from a biblical standpoint, a lot of the narrative is have faith, have a greater faith and trust in this immaterial force or being. And I think that even if you don't identify as Christian or with the Bible, that's a very healthy standpoint to have with recognition of the relationship we have with this immaterial force or being. Okay, so I want to trust and have faith that this force or being or God can influence my life in some way. How is a whole other discussion, but that very faith that there is an engagement there and an influence happening from that immaterial force or being can be very soothing. Another thing is this relinquishing of control. There's this idea of locus of control within psychology, which is that there are things outside of our locus of control we cannot manage. Other people's reactions, environmental circumstances, other people's emotional responses to things and how other people feel. And sometimes there are circumstances that we find ourselves in that we can't avoid. For example, certain health conditions or slavery, for example, right? Being in Nazi concentration camps, that is a huge influence. It's something that isn't our fault, that we find ourselves in, a big challenge, right? So there are these things that come up in life that are kind of like that. Again, certain health conditions. And then there's inner locus of control, which is things we can take the reins on. And you can see there's a little bit of a gray line, because if I treat my body poorly and I eat a bunch of sugar and junk and I don't nourish my body in an effective, healthful way, then I may experience certain diseases or health problems, right? And that is within my locus of control. Also, where I choose to put myself, what kind of environments I choose to put myself in, can make me more susceptible to different challenges and traumas, right? So our inner locus of control is really about how we emotionally react and the decisions and choices that we personally make. Now, this belief in God isn't meant to disregard that locus of control. We don't put our hands up and say, God's going to take care of it. God's in control. I have faith He's going to manage it. So no matter what I do, it's going to just happen as it should. this mentality is something that comes up in pantheistic spiritual ideologies. So Hinduism, New Age spiritualities, Buddhism, Taoism, you will see that ideology in there where it's like, no matter what I do, it's all in alignment with God. And that's because they have this basis idea that God is its creation. This immaterial force or being is a part of its creation, versus monotheistic belief systems such as Islam, Christian ideologies, Catholic ideologies. Those are monotheistic. They believe that Jewish spiritual ideology, creator is separate from its creation. And although it can influence its creation, creation is still kind of doing its own thing. So this is the difference between monotheism and pantheism. Very important difference to be aware of, because of this factor that it's not healthful to relinquish control of our free will. It's not healthful to diminish the power of our choice and our free will. And that is kind of what that pantheistic ideology does. So if we can take the reins on like, okay, I'm going to check my behavior and hold myself radically accountable for how I'm engaging with things. And I believe that God can influence the situation so that there is a greater sense of meaning and purpose and worth for the conflict. Now, that is a very psychologically supportive spiritual mentality to have. And the reason being, because if you're facing challenge or conflict, you're still acknowledging the power that we individually have within our choice. I can become more aware of how I'm choosing to interact with another person, and I can become more accountable for how I might be contributing to the conflict or the miscommunication or the challenge that's at hand. However, when there are things outside of our control, we can also relinquish some burden that it's all on us to manage the conflict. And we can then open ourselves up to there being some other greater influence or opportunity at hand, right? I think this is really, really important because you see varying degrees of faith in God. And this is within all kinds of spiritual ideologies, right? There are some people that are, like I said, on one end of the spectrum, they just relinquish all control or sense of value of free will and choice. They relinquish all of that. And they say, oh, well, God's going to just take care of it no matter how I act. God's going to make it turn to the best situation for me. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is this is like almost a lack of spirituality, where it's like, I have to manage this entire situation, and the success of this situation is completely on my shoulders, and how I act and what my choices are, right? Those are kind of like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think a psychologically healthful spirituality is somewhere in the middle, that we have that radical accountability of ourselves complemented with a faith in God and a receptivity to God showing up and doing something we might not expect. In conflict, what could this look like? Well, it could look like taking a step back, and prayer is a really helpful tool to not only call in this immaterial force or being, but also to let go. So it works from inside out, outside in when you practice prayer. We also can let go of that burden that it's all on us. It's like this acknowledgement, right? Okay, I'm going to give this to God, and God, I call you in and ask you to help guide me in this. What's the lesson for me in this? And, I also, maybe there could be a prayer for that other person's search for whatever their goal is, and that God helps them meet that goal in his seen way, or God's version of that happening. So, there's this surrender and this calling in that's kind of happening with prayer. So it's stepping back in conflict, taking a moment for that, and then taking accountability. Okay, what's my part in this? What's my part in the outcome? Well, I have to communicate, right? To some level, I have to communicate. And we have a couple choices, really. We move away from, we move towards, or we just kind of are neutral in our response and reaction. Really, I'd say you're either moving towards or you're moving away. That on a fundamental level, that's kind of your options with how you respond. So moving towards someone would look like, hey, I really want to figure this out. We can look at the common purpose. How do you think we could both, come to understand or hear or see each other? Hearing that other person out, and taking accountability for maybe how we disrespected their boundaries, and hopefully they would do the same, right, for us. But we can't act in a way that is fixated and dependent on how that other person is responding. We have to take radical accountability for our level of engagement with that other person, no matter how they respond to us, right? And so sometimes, even if we are doing the best that we know how to do, and that other person just isn't in a place to manage conflict from that space of unity and moving towards one another and connectivity, then no matter how hard you try, they may still turn away from you, right? And they may still not contribute to finding a solution. And that's unfortunate, and that's challenging, and we have to grapple with what comes with that. But again, this is where that faith in God comes in, where it's like, okay, God, I pray that you come into this and show me what my lesson is in this. Help me manage these hurt feelings that I have. And, Lord, I pray that you just empower that person through their path and whatever path they're on. We see this challenge come up a lot when it's like, when we really care about someone because we want to help them in some way, or we want them to align with our perspective because we think our perspective is better. Otherwise, why would we believe in it? We're not going to believe in something that we think is less than, as far as options that we're aware of is concerned. So obviously, when you're in conflict, you believe your opinion may be more superior than the other person's for whatever reason. And that just may not be true for them and for that person at that time. There also could be something that we have to open up our lens to learning about or being receptive to. So it's such a balance. Wow. How dynamic is that? No one, two conflicts are like the same. It's all contextual. And then it's this like ebb and flow, right? You constantly have a chance to respond, or you're being engaged with, and it's kind of this back and forth type situation. And what's even more challenging is that there's times to be like radically honest and truthful. There's times to be really, really soft and gentle. There's times to focus on encouragement and hope, and then there's other times when you kind of do have to disengage if there is a really unhealthy dynamic at hand. And our perception can be warped, so it's challenging to determine what's the best plan of action at times, right? Because of these stories and narratives we tell ourselves, we can warp our perception into thinking avoidance and disconnection is the best solution when maybe it's not. We can also be warped into thinking that, I'm just going to compliment this person and ignore the problem at hand to create unity again, right? There's some irrational beliefs happening in there that are not curating authentic peacemaking and authentic connection. You're kind of glossing over the conflict, and that's another type of avoidance really happening. Even though you're not fully disengaging, right? You're avoiding the challenge, avoiding the conflict, avoiding the discussion that might need to happen. So again, it's very dynamic, managing conflict. I hope that these perspectives and thoughts really maybe evoked some intentionality in how you manage conflict in your own life, or perhaps just gave you some food for thought to consider. I'd love to hear what's like one of the best things that you've heard as far as managing conflict. Is there any particular tool that you use that's been helpful? If you have any challenges or questions, I'd also love to hear about those, so feel free to reach out to me. Other than that, I'll see you guys next time.